Hey guys, and welcome back. I'm Steven from Tech Overseas. Today we are diving into React's useState hook, which is an essential tool for managing state in functional components. Now, in this video, I'm going to cover a lot of concepts because it's essential to understand how useState actually works under the hood, and we'll also explore how useState actually makes our code cleaner and easier to work with. So let's jump right in. Alright, so prior to this, I have created a very simple Next.js application. As you can see, I have a counter component, and the counter component for now is actually empty. So let's start by breaking down useState. So we are going to import useState, and for now we are going to say constant state equals useState. Okay, so we import useState, and for now we won't pass anything in useState. Now let's have a look at the TypeScript definition for useState. So to check the TypeScript definition, you can press Command and click on useState, and it will bring you to the TypeScript definition. As you can see, useState will actually take a state or a function returning a state. Then it returns an array with exactly two elements, the state and then the dispatch action function that will allow you to actually modify the state. So now that we see this, how do we actually use it? So let's go back to our counter component example and let's console log the state. So if I save, you can see that right now we have an array with exactly two elements. The first element is undefined, it's our state, and the second element is the function, which is the dispatch action function, which will modify the state. And the reason why it's undefined for now is because we have passed nothing in useState. Now in useState, you can pass any data type and it can also be a function. So let's pass the number 10, let's save, and as you can see now, we actually have 10 and we have the function. Now you have probably seen useState before, and this is not how we generally use it, okay? We can simplify this by using array destructuring in order to pull out state and then setState. So we can remove state and we can say state and setState. And if we save, you can see that we no longer have an array. Now we have the state immediately because we have destructured the state. Bear in mind that you can name these two values, so state and setState, anything you want, okay? So you can have state setState, user setUser, data setData, and so on. Now, as we saw in the TypeScript definition, there is also another way to set a default value, and that is to pass a function to useState. And so the advantage of using the function is that we can use it, for example, for expensive computation, or if our state depends on a prop that we want to instantiate immediately. So let's use a prop example. Let's say that our counter component will actually take a default count, which will be a number. So count number, we will remove our default value, and in useState, we are going to pass a function. So this function for now is going to return 10, okay? So we can save and you can see that we still have the same number. We still have 10, we still have the same result. Now what we can do, we can actually use the count from the prop and we can say return count times 2, okay? Now in our page, we are actually going to add the count. We can say 10. Now if we save, okay, if I save, you can see that now we get 20. So using a function as an initial value allowed us in this case to actually use the count prop that is passed to the counter component. Now let's pause for a second to really understand how all this works, okay? Now React will actually keep track of your state variables and their setters, and it will associate them to your component instance. Now how does it work under the hood? The setState function doesn't immediately change the state. Instead, React will actually schedule a new re-render. However, this new re-render will not happen immediately. Instead, React will actually batch multiple requests together for performance reasons, and only then it will re-render your component. Now, in order to update the state, we have to use setState. And so setState can be called in two ways. So let's go back to the type definition. So again, to see the type definition, command click on useState, and then command click on setState action. As you can see, you can either pass a new state, which will overwrite the old state, or you can pass a function that will take the previous state as an argument and return a new state. So whatever you return, this will be the new state. Also, when you're not sure about something, do not hesitate to go in the type definition, because this will tell you exactly everything you have to know about a variable, a function, and so on. So let's actually go back to our counter component. Now, in order to showcase setState, we can actually create a very simple counter logic where we say counter set counter, and it's going to instantiate the counter to be 0. Now we can remove the count prop because we don't need this anymore, and we can also remove the count here, we don't need it. Now remember that you can actually name counter and set counter anything you want. Now let's go ahead and create a very simple increment function that is going to increment the counter by 1. So we use the counter value in order to increment the counter by 1. Let's also show our counter in the page with a button in order to call the increment function. Now if I save and I click increment, you can see that the counter actually increment 1 by 1. Let's refresh the page so the counter resets to 0. Now, if you remember what I said about React batching multiple state update together, you might see how this could lead to unexpected result. Let's duplicate the set counter to actually call it twice. Here, I guess you would expect the count to be 2 because setState is called twice, right? So if I save and I press increment, you can see that it's not incrementing by 2, it's only incrementing by 1. Now, this is because both set counter calls are actually based on the same value of counter, and since React batches them together, they both end up setting the counter to 1. Now, in order to fix this, we can use the function update method that we saw previously. So instead of using the counter as a reference here, we can simply say prev counter, for example, which takes the previous counter value, and then we use this previous counter value to increment by 1. So what it's going to do, each instance is actually going to use the real previous value of the counter and increment it by 1. So if I save, from 6 we go to 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, and so on. Now let's take a more practical example. Say that you want to save a user in a state. So we can say constant user, set user equals useState, and then we pass an object, which is the name and the age. Let's import useState. Now, while it's often cleaner to use multiple useState for different pieces of state, sometimes you might want to group related state together, like in this case, there is no need to have two state, we can have one state with name and age. It's also very important to understand that whatever you pass into setUser will completely override the previous state, and so when using object or arrays, if you only want to update a specific part of the state, you have to handle this manually. So in our case with setUser, for example, if we want to change the age, we cannot simply say setUser and pass a new object with only the new age inside, because if we do that, it will overwrite the state altogether, which will remove the name property. So instead, we have to copy the previous object and append the modified age property. So let's go ahead and actually print our name and an age. Okay, so we have, hello John Doe, you are 30 years old. This is good. Now we are going to create an increment function. So increment age function, and this is going to take no argument, and all it does, it's actually going to return, so it's going to copy our user and then pass a new age property. Let's add a button in order to increment the age. So now if I save, if I press, you can see that we increment the age by 1 and it's working as expected. Now if you remember what I said about batching multiple requests, you can see that now we pass actually a reference to our current user, and we should avoid doing this. So we can use the function method and say previous user and actually return a copy of the previous user state, and then we append the age property. So if I save, you can see that nothing changes, it still works as expected. A very important point is that React state update should be immutable, which means that you should not directly mutate the previous state. Instead, you should return a new object or a new array. So in our case, for example, we cannot simply just say previous user age ++ and then return our previous user. You can see that it's actually not going to work because React state is immutable and you should return a new state. For arrays, it actually works the same. So let's go ahead and remove all this code, and we are going to create a list of items. So items set items equals useState, and we can pass as a default value a list of items from 1 to 10, okay? Now what we are going to do, we are going to render this list in the page. So div then is going to take a UL, we map over the item, and we return a li, simply just like that. Now if I save, we can see that in our page we have items from 1 to 10, okay? Now if we want to add an item, for example, we cannot simply pass the item in set items, we have to copy the previous state and then add the item. So let's create a button here in order to actually handle add item, just like that. And so this function will add a new item and will increment the number from the last item in the list. So constant handle item, it's not going to take any argument. And what it's going to do is going to do set items. We're not going to copy the list directly. We are going to use the function update method and get the previous state. So now we can return a new array where we copy the previous state and then we append a new item in the list. However, what we want to do, we want to get the last item in the array and then increment the number. So we can say last item is just like that, and then last item number is going to equal to our last item dot split, and then we can say dot pop. So just like that, we get the number 1 to 10, okay? And so now we are not going to say mat.random, we can say number, last item number plus 1. Now, if I save, if I click on add item, you can see that it's actually incrementing the item number. Now, to remove an item, we have to filter the array with the item that we want to get rid of. So in our case, instead of having the li, we are going to have a button. On click of a button, we are going to handle remove the item. So let's call this function handle remove item, and we can simply pass the item. Constant handle remove is going to take the string. And so as you can see, we are actually calling setItems with the function update method. And what it's doing, it's filtering out the previous state with the item that we want to get rid of. So now if I save, you can see that I can click 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, and so on, and it removes the item. Now, if I click add item, it adds a new item and it increments from the previous item counts. And finally, to update an item, we can simply map over the previous state and then update only a specific item. And so for this case, what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually create a second button just below this one, and I'm going to, on click, it's going to handle rename item. We're going to pass the item. The key is no longer here. Now the key is on the div because the parent has the key. Now for the handle rename item, we are going to create it. It will take also a string, and yeah, this is good. So as you can see, we are using the function update method. And so we are mapping over the previous list of items. And when we find the match, we simply rename the item, otherwise we ignore. And so in the renaming here, we are going to say mat.random. Now, as you can see, we have a new button, and so I can still remove my item, I can still add my items, and I can now rename the item. So when I click, it only renamed the item that is clicked on. So when using useState, it's actually important to be smart about it. So obviously, you can use as many useState as you have state, or you can have one object with multiple property and therefore have one state only. It really depends on your code architecture and your code structure. Now, let's say that you have two states and then you have two components, and each component has its own state, right? As you know, in React, we pass prop down to the components. And so we are going to see three scenarios. For this example, I have actually created a very simple component. And so this component has a single state with the username and the user age. It has a handle change function where we are going to set the user property based on which field is actually being changed, either the name or the age. And we render the component A and we render the component B. And so in the component A, I can show you, we have a console log saying component A is rendered, and it only takes care of modifying the name of the user. And the component B says console log component B is rendered, and it only takes care of modifying the age of the user. Now, let's cover the first scenario where we are actually passing both states to both components, okay? So as you can see here, in component A, we pass the user, and in component B, we also pass the user. Now, let's open the dev tool, and we are going to actually increment the age. And when we increment the age, you can see that component A is re-rendered and also component B is re-rendered. And component A is re-rendered even though the name hasn't changed. Now, if we do the opposite, if we change the name of the component A, we can see that component A is re-rendered, obviously, but also the component B is re-rendered. And as you can see, because we pass the full state to both objects, any update to the state will cause both components to actually re-render. So this is usually not best practice. And so the second scenario is that each component only needs a specific part of the state. So you can actually split the state into two states and only pass the necessary parts to each component. So let's actually refactor our component. So we are going to have constant name and then set name, and we can default again to John Doe. And we are also going to have the age. So age set age, and we can default to 30. Now, what we are going to do here, we are going to do a simple if condition. If event target.name is equal to name, we set the name, otherwise we set the age, and we are going to convert the age from a string to a number, all right? Now we no longer have a user dot, so I can get rid of this. And in the component A, we are going to only pass the name, all right? And in the component B, we are only going to pass the age. Now let's refactor our component A and component B. So component A only has the name and it's a string. Here it takes the name, and here we don't have user.name, we just have the name. And for our component B, it only has the age, which is a number. It takes the age and it puts the age in here. So we can save, all right? Now I will clear the console, and now if I increment the age, you can see that only the component B is re-rendered and not the component A anymore. And now in the component A, if I put Steven, you can see that whatever I type, only the component A is being rendered. So the second scenario is actually best practice because we only pass the necessary props to each component and not the full state anymore. And so there is a third scenario where you can actually keep the grouping from the first scenario, but you will only use the necessary property for each component. And so this approach really provides a balance between the first scenario and the second scenario. So let's refactor our code and let's go back to having only one state. So we are going to say constant user set user useState, and again it will have our name, our age, and we'll default again to John Doe. Now our handle change, it will be the same as before. So we have constant name value, and then we update the user and we update only the field that is being changed. So in the component A it's the name, in the component B it's the age. Now here we have user.name, here we have user.age, and here is the same, user.name, user.age. Now, if I save, if I clear the console, you can see that if I update the age, same thing is happening. Only the component B is re-rendered, even though we have a single shared state. And for the component A, if I put Steven, or if I put anything, you can see that only the component A is re-rendered, even though, again, we have a shared state. So this is very important to understand that the way React works really depends on your code architecture and your code structure. So when you're working on a project, you actually have to think ahead of how you're going to structure your project in order to avoid unnecessary render and in order to optimize your code. So a very common mistake that I often see people do is to actually keep derived state in a separate state. And so a derived state is actually a value that heavily depends on one or multiple other states. So let's see how it works. We will no longer have a full name, okay? Instead, we will split it into first name and then into a last name. So we still have our John Doe, but we have a first name and a last name. And so what I would see people do, so not specifically in this very simple scenario, but in other scenario, okay? They would create a full name state. And so the full name state will actually be the first name plus the last name. And then every time the user updates, you also need to update the full name. So let's say if our name is first name, we will replace the first name in the name and then append the existing last name. Now let's print our full name in the page. Let's pass here the first name because the first name is actually the new value that we want to change, okay? So now if I save here, you can see that it still worked as expected. So I am Alex Doe, I am Patrick Doe. However, it's not best practice because it means that your user logic is heavily tied with your full name logic. So everywhere in your code you're updating your user first name, you also need to handle the update of the full name. And so let's say that there is a place in your code where you update the first name. However, you forget to update the full name. Now what you're going to have, you're going to see that your full name is now not synced anymore with your first name. So you have a problem. So how do you actually fix this? You remove your extra logic, you remove your extra state, and so you create a new variable that is using the user's property. And so now if I save, you can see that it behaves as expected. I am Alex Doe and I am Patrick Doe. And that's it, guys. I hope you like this video. Now you have everything you need to know about React useState hooks. I'm going to create a separate video in order to show you how to create custom hooks using useState. Now, if you have any questions or if there is anything you would like me to cover next, let me know in the comment. Thank you for watching, and until then, happy coding.